Have you ever camped in the woods in the dirt? Did you hike with a stride that made your feet and knees hurt? Yet all you really wanted was to sit around the fire, but you can't build one now because of Smokey the Buyer. Give yourself a wine pour and join us online for the Least Haunted Campfire Club. It's the Least Haunted Campfire Club, so plug in your ears and cork up your gizzard and shut your eyes like the pinball wizard. It's the summer of 2022 and we got scary stories for you from a small coastal range in the mountains of California.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to the penultimate meeting of the Campfire Club for the 2022 season. As you can see, it is still not safe to have a fire here in our neck of the woods, so we have this beautiful digital fire created by Garth. And we are lucky this time to have yet another listener-submitted piece of original spooky fiction. This one comes from Least Haunted superfan, Monster Squadron patron producer, and our friend who gets to enjoy the Campfire Club as a winter treat since he hails from Aotearoa, or New Zealand, as we call it up on the Northern Hemisphere. This is a story from Jarryd Ford-Manson, aka New Jarryd, and it is called Just a Little Off the Top. Enjoy. About 15 years ago, I was living in a relatively small town, 30 minutes east of a slightly larger small town, which was still an hour away from anywhere interesting. While out one night enjoying what passes for nightlife in this town, I bumped into an old high school friend from the next town over. Over drinks, we caught up on life's changes over the last few years, which were few for me, to be fair. They proudly told me that they had recently opened up a small hairdresser and barber shop in their childhood neighborhood. They took a quick glance at my hair and suggested I come to the salon soon to tidy things up a bit. I wasn't exactly sure how to take that. Maybe it was just an excuse to see me again. Maybe I really needed sorting out. Who knows? I'd kind of let things get out of hand a bit, if I'm honest. It was the longest and least kempt it had ever been. Plus, I was a little drunk and very much enjoying the company, so I said I'd swing by. We settled on a date and a time in the next couple of weeks, then continued our evening of reminiscing about the old times at school and the times we skipped school. It was the best night out I'd had in a long time. A couple of weeks later, the day came for my haircut, or treatment, or whatever was going to happen. I vaguely remember agreeing to, quote, just do whatever you think looks right, when I was 6 whiskeys deep. What was I thinking? I had gotten so used to looking the same way for years, and I was more than a little anxious about change. We joked about me getting a bright pink mohawk. At least I hoped it was a joke. I did my best to push those feelings of dread down and remembered the great night we'd shared, the memories, the laughs, and far too much to drink. I'll be all right. I jumped into my car, a quirky little red hatchback I'd bought just after high school. It wasn't new then, but it was mine, and I loved it. Even though it was dirty and the back seat was piled with empty boxes from my job, it always started first time. I drove west to head out of town, but before I got there, I came across some fairly substantial roadworks. I hadn't seen these roadworks in the last couple of weeks, and I was often out this way with my work. They must have just started today or yesterday, although there didn't seem to be any machinery or workers right now. The road had been completely ripped up for at least a mile or two. There were orange traffic cones and warning signs everywhere, and one detour sign pointing off to the left. I took the detour, hoping it wasn't going to make me too late. It was down a much smaller road, only one lane each way, with a rougher surface and flanked by farmland. The thought crossed my mind that I had never been down this road in the 27 years I'd lived in this town. Why would I? We always took the main road to the next town. I wondered how many roads in town I could say the same about. I neared a lazy right bend and took it a little faster than I should have. I was trying to hurry a little to make up for the time I thought I'd lose due to this detour. As the bend opened up, the sun was setting ahead of me. We'd agreed to meet at the salon just before closing so we wouldn't be interrupted by customers. I was hoping for more laughs and memories and maybe some more shared whiskey or wine. I'd packed an overnight bag, just in case, but I felt my face flush at the thought of it. I slowed a little on the unfamiliar highway and tried to make out the road ahead of me. The angle of the incline pointed me directly at the setting sun, and my sunglasses did little to help. I could swear I could see a car in the distance. This wouldn't normally pique my interest, but there was something familiar about the car. Before I could figure out why, the car disappeared. I thought for a second I was imagining things. After 50 meters or so, the road fell sharply, enough for my stomach to leap into my throat. I could see the car ahead of me again, and with the sun no longer obscuring the view, I could see why it looked familiar. I could swear it was the same make and model as my car. This can't have been one of those Bader-Meinhof things, because I'd had this car for over 9 years. But my town was so small, and I had never seen another car quite like mine. There was a slightly newer model owned by my mother's dog groomer, but that one was green, and absolutely no one passes through our town. I was intrigued. I put my foot on the gas a little to get a closer look and closed the gap between us by about a third. It was definitely the same make and model, exactly the same color too. Then suddenly it disappeared again. This time I knew exactly why. There was a sharp curve to the right, which brought them behind a tall hedge that bordered a farm. Just before they disappeared, I thought I spotted the same blue bumper sticker on the bottom right, like I had put on my bumper just weeks after buying the car. What a coincidence that would be. As I rounded the curve and the car came back into view, I sped up to get even closer. They did indeed have a blue bumper sticker right where I had mine. I couldn't tell if it also said, "My other car is a Constitution-class starship," as I was a little too far away and it was very dirty, just like mine. I pressed my foot harder on the go pedal to get even closer. I wanted to see the license plate. Maybe the car was registered around the same time as mine, and we'd be close in sequence. As the number came into focus, I found myself not quite remembering what my own license plate number was, exactly. Was the last number an 8 or a 3? Or am I remembering my dad's license plate on that old beater he used to take us camping in? Surely they didn't have the same license plate as me. That would be weird. I could barely make out the driver at all, just a vague idea of a silhouette in behind a dirty rear window and piles of boxes. Or was it in front of, considering the direction we were traveling? I decided to overtake them so I could catch a look at the driver as I passed. I dropped down a gear, pulled out into the lane, and accelerated hard. The strangest thing. As I performed this maneuver, the car ahead of me seemed to anticipate my move and sped up too, also moving into the other lane just as I had. I slowed a little and moved back into my lane. The other car, too, did exactly the same. The odd thing is, they didn't seem to decelerate and move in response to me. They did it at precisely the same time and rate that I did. It was a very uncanny feeling. Surely just a coincidence. The road started rising again, and we curved around another hedge and a bend to the left and joined back onto the main highway. With better lighting and 2 lanes each way, now was my chance to get a look at this driver. I could tell we were getting close to the next town as we were passing the standard stretch of farming equipment sales companies, each with their bevy of tractors and irrigators and tillers and threshers and balers, out on display on the grass verge next to the road. It was getting dark and they loomed like metal monsters in the gloom. I moved slightly to one side of my lane to get a better view ahead. The car in front did the same, simultaneously. I moved all the way over to the last lane, too quick to be very safe. Again, the other car matched my movement exactly. It was almost like looking at a mirrored version, even though the car was facing away from me. I swerved back and forth between the lanes, sometimes fast, sometimes slow. Each time they kept precisely in step with me. If it weren't so damn creepy, it'd be fascinating. Just then my phone, on the passenger seat, chirped its little message ditty that made me flinch. I instinctively looked down to see who the message was from. I could see it was from my old friend. I could see the start of the message. Quote, "Hey, running a little late. Hope you don't..." I looked back up at the road and saw that the car was no longer driving just ahead of me. No, it was around 100 meters away and headed right for me. I swerved back into the fast lane, and the other car literally mirrored my movement this time. I swerved to the other side towards the grass verge. They matched my position perfectly, and I started to skid and slide as I braked hard. We were about to collide into each other's side. Just before I closed my eyes, expecting the impact, I could have sworn I saw the driver on the other side of the car closest to me, a perfect mirror image. My car skipped up onto the grass verge, and my tires bit deep into the earth, but not enough to stop me plowing right into, well, a snowplow, which sat outside one of the farming equipment companies, the kind that would attach to the front of a tractor. My car was badly damaged, probably beyond what my insurance company would pay to repair. The front was a foot shorter than it had started life as, and there were fluids leaking and steam billowing. The windscreen was shattered, but I was okay. The airbag had deployed and done its job, but I was sore, and shaking, and cold, and in shock. I leaned against my door and forced it open with a loud clang. Stumbling out into the verge, I found my feet were heavy and like jelly. How did I miss hitting that other car? I pondered, maybe out loud, who knows. They were right there. I turned around in a circle looking for the other car, wondering where they had gotten to. About 50 meters behind me, I could see the car, also on the verge, also looking very much like it had crashed. I circled slowly toward them, getting closer, but also keeping my distance a little. It was still creeping me out, as the car was still exactly the same as mine, or nearly. As I got closer, I saw that the blue bumper sticker was now on the left. I moved a bit quicker until I could make out the license plate. The numbers and letters looked very weird to me, like a foreign language. Maybe I'd hit my head too hard in spite of the airbag. I squeezed my eyes open and shut a couple of times and looked again. It wasn't a foreign language. It was backwards. Truly reversed, as if in a mirror. I crept slowly around to the driver's side of the car. My car? They had crashed into a large tractor, which had been fitted with one of those front-loader-type buckets for earth-moving duties. The bucket had been raised, presumably for showing-off purposes, to about the height of the bottom of the car's windshield. The force of the impact had driven the bottom horizontal portion of the bucket through the windscreen and into where the driver would have been sitting. I pried open the door, both hoping and dreading that the driver was still there. The driver was indeed still there. Well, most of them anyway. Still sitting upright, both feet firmly on the brake pedal, arms locked straight and hands gripping the wheel tightly, wearing my jeans, my sneakers, and my green hoodie. But where their head should have been was obscured by the bucket of the tractor. Surely they couldn't have survived that. Their head would have been sliced clean off. I stepped back a little to look in through one of the rear windows, into the opening of the bucket. It was empty. I turned to look down into the rear passenger seat, and there it was. There I was, my bloody disembodied head, eyes wide open in terror, with a pink fucking mohawk. Kerry Creek, Chapter 1. The rustling sound of the wind blowing through the darkened willows, coupled with the babbling bubble of the creek as I lay awake, made me regret setting my tent up where I did. When I had picked the spot, I was sure that the gentle sounds of nature would serve to lull me into a relaxed and deep sleep. However, as it would turn out, my ears, which were accustomed to the bustling and near-constant hum of the city, could not cope with the alien near silence that was to be found here next to Kerry Creek. I say near silence because, as I have already mentioned, the breeze rustled willow leaves and the constant sound of water passing over stone, tumbling around exposed tree roots and tugging at the muddy banks, was quite deafening, in a quiet sort of way. As I lay there behind the flimsy nylon walls of my tent, eyes open to the darkness, I could almost imagine that mixed in with the sound of the water were formless voices, neither definitely male nor decidedly female, but with a musical bell-like quality. My heart began to hammer fiercely in my chest as I strained to make out what these strange and mysterious voices could be saying. But just as I was beginning to think that I could make out words, the illusion was ruined as I realized that what I had mistaken for human voices were actually just an auditory illusion caused by the sounds of the creek water as it tumbled over submerged stones and burbled in small eddies and currents. I had heard of this phenomenon before, pareidolia, or the tendency of the human brain to find patterns in otherwise random stimuli. That was all it had been. I could feel my cheeks turn red in the darkness and was ashamed at my foolishness. I had heard these voices for the last 3 nights running, and each time had the same momentary terror before having to remind myself of pareidolia again. This whole deal with the house had been getting to me. I guess I really should explain why it was that I was sleeping in a tent beside a creek under a canopy of willows in the middle of a high alpine valley in the Sierras. The reason was that I was meant to be cleaning out the house of my recently deceased great-uncle, a man whom I had never met, but as it had turned out, I was his only next of kin, so it came as quite the surprise when I was contacted by an attorney and informed that I had inherited a dilapidated 2-story Gold Rush-era ranch house in the remote Sierra High Country. And seeing as I had recently found myself in a position of domicile freedom, so to speak, and also bereft of a profitable future, that is to say, homeless and unemployed, I decided to make the several-hour drive across the state to see what this long-lost relative had left for me. The house was located near the end of a long dirt road that branched off of the old Gold Highway as it passed through a small town at the southern end of the Great Sierra Valley. The valley was indeed great in its size, but with the exception of a few small towns similar to this one, it was empty save for vast alfalfa fields and cattle. The town itself had a population of approximately 100 residents, according to the most recent census, although the sign at the entrance to town claimed it was 350, and had so for maybe 20 years. If I was hoping to find a house fit to move right into, I was gravely mistaken. I would have been equally mistaken if I was merely expecting a house in which I could maybe sleep in at all. As it turned out, my great-uncle had been a hoarder of the worst kind. That is, the academic hoarder. Floor to ceiling and wall to wall, almost every possible space was taken up by books and boxes of books. What space wasn't taken up by books was taken up by newspapers and ancient yellowed magazines. Although the house was 2 stories and had 6 rooms to it, it was completely unfit for human occupation. How my great-uncle had lived here was beyond my imagining. The only rooms that were not completely overtaken by the glacial progress of bound paper were the bathroom and the kitchen, although the kitchen had its own problems, namely the mountains of cardboard food boxes and countless filthy dishes. Luckily for me, I had brought along the tent that I was currently lying awake in. The property on which the house stands is, for the most part, indistinguishable from the rest of the empty alfalfa-filled valley, except that along the back of the property a line of thick willow trees gave the telltale sign of running water, and that running water was Kerry Creek. I picked a nice flat spot right on the bank of the creek and set up my tent. It was nearly evening, and I decided that with what little daylight I had left, I should make the short drive into what passed for downtown and see what sort of options were available for food. The search proved fruitless. It seemed that the only store in town, a small single-pump gas station with a general store attached, closed at 5 o'clock every day. It being 6:30 by the time I showed up, it seemed I had missed the gravy train. Driving the remaining 300 yards to the end of town, I found that there was a small Mexican restaurant, which unfortunately was closed that day. I would end up dining on stale potato chips and a half bag of beef jerky that I found underneath my passenger seat, washed down with the remaining warm half of a flat bottle of cola that I had picked up several hours before at a gas station in Sacramento. I ate this sorry excuse for a meal sitting on the old wooden steps that led to the back door of the house. The wood was grayed and peeling up along the grain, undoubtedly the result of the freezing snowy winters and dry arid summers of the area. I gazed over the short distance of tall, overgrown alfalfa at the green willow scar in the valley that was Kerry Creek. I knew it was called Kerry Creek due to the metal sign on the bridge that passed over it as the old highway entered town. I briefly wondered who Kerry had been. I remembered that I had seen a small pioneer cemetery atop a low hill alongside the dirt road, somewhere between the house and town. I decided that I would have to go check it out sometime in the next few days. Maybe I would find a Kerry amongst the old weathered headstones and grave marking boards. From my vantage, I could see above and past the tops of the willows and out into the Great Sierra Valley. I could see clear across to the other side, nearly 30 miles as the crow flies. And just as I was gazing out, the setting sun behind the western wall of the valley began to light the sky on fire. Brilliant hues of orange, salmon, and purple, a show of colors I had never seen in all of my life in the city. If this is what every sunset had to offer up here in the high country, I figured that clearing out the house and putting down some roots here wouldn't be all too bad. I soon discovered, to my dismay, that although the bathroom was still accessible and that the water had somehow miraculously been left on, there was no hot water for a shower in the ancient cast-iron tub. I would have been better off bathing in the creek. However, I did reflect as I came freezing and wet out of the bathroom that given all of the flammable materials crowding the house, maybe it was a good thing that the tiny pilot flame of the unlocated hot water heater was not lit. I made a small effort of exploring the contents of the book-filled living room as I waited for the last bit of moisture to evaporate from my hair. The sun had finished its show while I was in the shower, and so only the last bit of twilight passed through the windows as the Great Sierra Valley settled into the darkness that only sparsely populated high places of the world enjoy. A darkness enhanced by the lack of streetlights, yet also somewhat lessened by the abundance of stars. In either case, it was too dark to see without turning on a light, and I did so. Thankfully, the electric company must have had the same record keepers as the water company. I knew nothing at all about my great-uncle. In fact, I had until recently been unaware of his existence at all. My grandmother had never mentioned that she had a younger brother. I examined the threadbare nature of the armrests on an ancient burlap-upholstered chair. I thought about how many uncountable times the old man must have used those armrests to pull against and hoist up his weary bones. The cushion had a noticeable sag in the middle, the remnant of the glacial-like erosion of backside on chair after many years of sitting. There were also unknowable stains, undoubtedly left over from bachelor meals for one. If the empty boxes and food tins in the kitchen were any indication, these meals consisted primarily of toaster waffles and canned sardines. I looked about and picked up a yellow newspaper. It was dated from June 1989. I gingerly spread it open and laid it upon the seat before setting myself into the chair. I leaned back and tried to imagine myself in the old man's shoes. Looking around from my position, I took in the room from what was once his vantage point. I started by looking directly across the room. A moth-eaten and dusty taxidermy pheasant stared back at me. It was mounted on the wall, wings spread in flight. Its beak was open, as if to indicate that it was making some sort of call, a call that would never be heard from a silent and cold beak. Passing my gaze clockwise around the room from there, it was mostly books and papers. Occasionally, glimpses of old, yellowed wallpaper could be glimpsed in the spaces between stacks of paper. When it was new, it might have been very colorful and depicted numerous species of flower. Now it was just a pale brown yellow and covered in faded brown splotches. Directly to my left was the entryway to the living room. Beyond it was a hallway that branched to the left. Down that way was the bathroom, in another room that was most likely some sort of sitting room or office at some point. The hallway ran parallel to the stairs that led to the upper floor. Across the hall was the kitchen. Bringing my gaze closer, I took a look at what was closest at hand. There was a stack of books on a small table next to the chair. Most had their spines turned away from me, except for the two at the top. The second book from the top of the stack claimed to be The Willows by Algernon Blackwood. I was somewhat aware of the name, or at least it sounded familiar, but the title itself was one I had never heard of before. I wondered if it was some sort of botanist treatise on willow trees. Was my great-uncle a botanist? Was that his secret? Maybe all of these papers and books were merely the evidence of a mind so caught up in research that the formalities of cleanliness and organization were only a passing concern. That was something I could at least understand. I would need to pay attention to the books as I cleared them out later. I thought that maybe some of them might be worth a little money. My musings on the secret fortune of first edition scientific books was interrupted as I looked at the topmost book on the stack and noticed there was no title, or any marking for that matter, on the leather spine. I reached over and picked it up, and turning it this way and that, I examined the binding. There were no markings on it. I opened it to the first page and found to my surprise that it was in fact a journal. Web-like cursive writing in blue ink scrawled across every page. It was a small and tight script that was hard to read. In fact, I had barely read anything in cursive since I had been forced to learn it back in elementary school. The only times it had been used was in signing my signature and in deciphering birthday and holiday cards from my grandmother. Thumbing through the journal, I saw that the earliest date was from 1978. The earliest entries were not for every day. Near the beginning of the book, there would sometimes be months between entries, but as I thumbed closer to the end, they became more frequent. Then they became weekly and eventually daily. The last entry was dated about a week before he died. I say died, but that is not actually the whole truth. In actuality, he was only assumed dead, since a body was never found. According to the attorney, the people in town had noticed that they had stopped seeing my great-uncle for a while, and the neighbors realized that it had been a really long time since they had seen the lights on, and maybe someone should go and check on the old man in the dilapidated old house. When they received no reply after knocking on the door and calling out "hello" many times, they decided to call the county sheriff. The sheriff drove the 14 miles from the main office in the county seat and performed a welfare check. The welfare check included a well-aimed kick to the door, and upon a cursory search, the sheriff had decided that the old man was indeed missing. After a reasonable amount of time, it was concluded that he must be dead. Perhaps he had wandered off during the winter storms and, in succumbing to the elements, was dragged off by scavengers. The valley did have a sizable population of coyotes that were known to make off with calves, and of course there were the bears that occasionally came down from the hills. The townsfolk and sheriff, and eventually even the coroner, concluded that it was just one of those things. After all, the man must have surely been suffering from some sort of mental illness given the state of affairs in the house. I had asked the attorney if there was a possibility that he might still be inside of the house. It was not unheard of for hoarders who were presumed missing to later be found tragically in their own homes, usually trapped under a collapsed pile of boxes or papers. I was told that this possibility had been considered, but that the sheriff had let a cadaver dog roam the house and climb over and around the various piles in the house, and that the dog had given no signs of smelling a corpse. As I struggled to decipher the handwriting in the journal, I considered trying to spend the night sleeping in the chair, just as the old man had undoubtedly done. But then I heard a drawn-out creak from somewhere in the depths of the second floor above me. I thought about the mysterious nature of his disappearance, and the image of a desiccated corpse beneath a pile of Sunday Times crossword puzzles and old Sears catalogs made me think twice. Also, it would be a shame to have wasted my time in setting up a tent in such a lovely and ideal spot. Taking the old journal with me, I turned out the living room light and made my way across the hallway so as to pass through the kitchen to the back door, and eventually across the overgrown stretch of field to my tent. But as I crossed the darkened hallway and at the foot of the stairs, I thought for a moment that I saw movement in my peripheral vision at the top of the stair. I turned my head slowly and saw the silhouette of a person standing in the darkness on the landing atop the stairs. I froze where I stood, scarcely able to move with fright. I fumbled for my robe pocket where I knew my flashlight was, and finding it, I shakily raised it up, pointed it up the stairs, and turned it on. There, at the top of the stairs, was nothing more than yet another stack of boxes and books. The darkness had been playing tricks on me. I let out the breath that I had been holding and let out a loud laugh at the absurdity of it all. I turned back towards the kitchen and, guided by flashlight beam, I made my way to the back door. As I closed it, I heard the loud creak from upstairs again. I decided that I really needed sleep after the long drive, and that my imagination was just running wild in this strange environment. Once in my tent, I stripped down to just my shirt and underwear and quickly slid inside my sleeping bag. It was still the middle of summer, and although the day had been warm, the nights were fairly cool in the high country, even at this time of year. The low temperature of the nights was due to a predictable nightly wind that would sweep across the valley from the northwest, and it proceeded to do so as I settled in with my flashlight to study the old journal before going to sleep. From what I was able to decipher, my great-uncle had, alas, not been a botanist. He had been what folks used to call an eccentric, which is what any person who lived alone and kept mostly to themselves were always called amongst the polite company in small towns everywhere. He seemed to have some technical skill as an engineer and electrician. A tinkerer, some might say. He made a little money by doing odd jobs and mechanical repairs on the cattle ranches and alfalfa harvesting machinery around the valley. For the most part, the journal was mainly concerned with records of the jobs he did around the valley, as well as accounts of various sojourns and explorations of the surrounding area. He became increasingly concerned about the history of the area, and especially that of the town itself. I was scanning through an entry about halfway through. It was from April 1990. When my eyes began to close and I almost dropped the book on my face as I struggled to stay awake, I decided to stop there and try to get some sleep. The last thing I read before closing the book was this line: "The creek holds the answer. It must be in the creek. I must find it." What could that mean? I decided that the mystery could wait until morning and put the book down and turned off my camping lantern. I listened to the wind in the willow branches and the babbling of the creek. My eyes grew heavy, and that's when I heard the voices for the first time. This has been the first part of a story entitled Kerry Creek, to be concluded next time. All right, well, that is going to do it for this meeting. Just one more meeting to go. If you have any stories, send them in quickly to get included. And once again, special thanks to New Jarryd for sending in his story just a little off the top. You know, I once had a blue mohawk. Now I don't have any hair at all. Life is funny like that. Sometimes it's ha-ha funny, and sometimes it is see your own severed head funny. Thank you, New Jarryd, for sending in that fun and spooky tale. And a quick reminder that we have our Least Haunted Secret Aardvark art contest going on right now. We have partnered with Secret Aardvark Trading Company to give away a few sets of a selection of their sauces to 2 lucky winners who send in or tweet to us an original piece of art depicting the Secret Aardvark mascot in a spooky situation. If you haven't tried Secret Aardvark, then the amazing flavor and spice remains, alas, a secret to you. One that you can learn by entering and winning our contest, or by visiting secretaardvark.com and ordering some of their amazing sauces. And with that out of the way, we wish you a very good night, and we will see you next time.
It was the least haunted campfire club. It was the least haunted campfire club. Oh, it's the least haunted campfire club. Audio show.
The Least Haunted podcast is recorded before a dead studio audience and is a presentation of Sequoia Productions, LLC.